Imperialism is part and parcel of Russian political DNA. It is obvious because Russia was always an empire, both before the revolution of 1917. The Russian state was an empire and a great power, and the Soviet Union, which is more relevant for the thinking of the mentality of the current Russian elite, was also an empire and a superpower. So within the political tradition that was inherited by the current Russian political elite, and to a certain extent by the entire Russian society, elements of imperialism, of imperial thinking, imperial mentality are simply there. They were inherited and then reinforced by the clash of interests between Russia and the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And one has to emphasize that there was almost a complete continuity in terms of elites between the Soviet Union and Russia and post-Soviet Russia. Even though the Soviet Union collapsed and the political system collapsed, people who run the current Russian Federation are simply officials, lower rank officials of the Soviet Union. Their thinking changed. Of course, it would be a simplification to say that they think in Soviet terms, but in terms of their political culture, in terms of their political mentality, elements of Soviet and even Russian imperial thinking are still there. What I mean by imperial thinking. First of all, this is the conviction that the Russians have a special right. One might always say a God-given right, or the right that's sort of inherent in the nature. It's a natural right, one might say, a natural right of the Russians to be politically predominant on the northern part of the Eurasia, from Pacific Ocean to Central Europe, that all the other nationalities and ethnic groups which live on this space, as the Russians say, are sort of should be naturally subordinate and kind of integrated into the Russian political nation and should be part of one single political organism, and that Russia, sort of by nature, is a great power which should have a right to shape world politics and be an very influential player on the international stage. That implies also that the Russian political elite thinks that, for example, Central Europe should be a kind of natural sphere of influence, kind of a natural buffer, security buffer of the Russian state. It also extends to of course, to their thinking on the issue of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Again, this goes very deep in Russian history. Already in the 19th century, when a modern Russian national identity and modern Russian political culture was being formed, one of the fundamental tenets of this identity was the refusal to recognize separate nationhood of Ukrainians, and by the way, the Belarusians as well. The Russian elite, which emerged on the rubble of the Soviet Union, was desperately looking for a new ideology, for the new identity, because they were fully aware that the Soviet ideology was no longer working and was really discredited and couldn't provide ideological basis for their state, for Russia. And in a way, it was natural that they rediscovered the Russian imperial tradition. And this is a kind of, one might say, a tragedy, that within that tradition, there were very few elements which were non-imperial or anti-imperial. One should mention, perhaps to be fair, that at the end of the 80s, during the Gorbachev times and the first years of the existence of the Russian Federation, let's say between 88 and 91, 92, there was an attempt to construct a Russian non-imperial identity. However, this attempt failed. It lost in sort of political competition that existed in Russia in the first early days of the Russian, post-communist Russian Federation. And the offer that was being formulated to the Russian society, for the Russian society, which was constructed on the basis of these historical elements, which included the imperial tradition. One might even say more strongly that this alternative that was being offered had put this imperial tradition at the very center. So the Russian society turned out to be very vulnerable and very open and ready to accept a neo-imperial or imperial version of national identity and political culture. And those political forces that were connected to a certain extent with the Yeltsin, early Yeltsin regime, which were trying to offer a non-imperial alternative, lost in the political struggle and were marginalized. Invocation of history is central to this imperial Russian narrative. It of course points to the fact that Russia was an empire, that this is a kind of sacred Russian tradition, that this is almost God-given right, that history created Russia as an empire, and this is kind of inherent right, it's a birthright of Russians to be part of the political organism, political organization that is powerful, that plays an important role on the international stage, and which has certain, this is important, which has certain missions to fulfill. That mission is to unify the so-called Eurasia, the area between, let's say, Central Europe and the Pacific Ocean, and between the Arctic and the southern steppe zone. It's the role of ensuring that international system is just, and the Russian elite ascribes to itself the role of being this balancer in international relations. So in the current situation, this is presented as a defense of those who suffer from the American and Western hegemony. So we've seen, especially in the last few years, a reemergence of an anti-colonial discourse, which is again a repetition to a large extent of the Soviet and the kind of rehash of the Soviet anti-colonial discourse, in which Russia is presented as a defender of those countries and those peoples who have historically suffered from Western hegemony and Western imperialism, and now Russia is defending them again, even if they don't ask for it.